My name is Josephine Calder. Everyone who ever served with me called me Joey. For 22 years, I wore the uniform of Army military intelligence, chasing signals that other people couldn't see, patterns hidden inside noise, threats that lived in the space between what people said and what they meant. I learned to read silence the way other people read sentences. I learned that the most dangerous thing in any operation was never the loud noise. It was the quiet one. I just didn't expect the quietest, most dangerous silence of my life to be waiting for me at my own front door. I'd spent my career overseas piecing together patterns that other analysts missed, financial trails hidden inside legitimate-looking transactions, communication networks disguised as innocent chatter, the small inconsistencies that told you someone was lying long before they said a single false word. I'd briefed generals. I'd sat in rooms where the wrong conclusion could cost lives, and I'd learned to trust evidence over instinct, patience over emotion. I thought that training had prepared me for anything the world could throw at me. It hadn't prepared me for my own family. I grew up in that house on Sycamore Ridge Road, in the kind of town where everyone still waved at each other from their porches, where my grandfather taught me how to read a compass before I could read a chapter book, where my grandmother grew hydrangeas along the front walk, so thick you had to turn sideways to get past them in July. I left for basic training 3 days after my 18th birthday, and every leave I ever had, every holiday I could scrape together enough days for, I came back to that house. It was the one fixed point in a career built entirely on being sent wherever I was needed, whenever I was needed there. It was late September when I came home for good. My discharge papers were still warm from the printer, tucked into a folder I'd carried through customs like it was classified. I stepped out of a cab 2 blocks from the house my grandfather built because I wanted to walk the last stretch. I wanted to feel the ground again before I felt anything else. I didn't own a car anymore. I'd sold my old sedan before my final deployment, figured I'd buy something new once I was settled. So I walked, duffel bag on one shoulder, discharge folder under my arm, toward the house on Sycamore Ridge Road where I'd spent every summer of my childhood. The porch light was on. For a second, just a second, it looked like welcome. Then the intercom crackled and my sister's voice came through it, flat and cold. "I'm calling the police." I actually laughed at first. I thought it was a joke, the kind of joke you make with someone you've known your whole life. "Dana, it's me. I know who it is." Her voice didn't move an inch. "You need to leave." I looked up. She was standing at the top of the porch steps, her phone already raised, thumb hovering over the screen like she'd rehearsed it. "I just got back," I said, and my voice caught on the last word, thin as paper. "I thought maybe I could see Mom." "Mom doesn't want to see you." Dana's face was carved out of something hard. "Neither does Dad." "Dana, you're not on the deed," she said. "You're not in the will. This isn't your house anymore. It hasn't been for a long time." "Since when?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Grandpa told me this house was mine. He told me himself, the week before he died." Something flickered across Dana's face. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it, gone, before I could be sure I'd seen it at all. "People say a lot of things at the end," she said. "The paperwork says something different. That's what matters now." Paperwork. "Since when do you care so much about paperwork?" I said, and I regretted it the second it left my mouth because her jaw tightened and the door to any real conversation closed a little further. "Since I had to clean up the mess you left when you disappeared for 2 decades, she snapped. "You don't get to walk back in here after 22 years and act like nothing happened. You chose the Army over this family a long time ago, Josephine. Don't stand on that porch and pretend you didn't." I opened my mouth to tell her that wasn't true. That every leave, every furlough, every long-distance phone call from a base with the 6-hour time difference had been proof of exactly the opposite. But she'd already stepped back from the intercom, and the porch light above me buzzed once and went dark. Like even the house had decided to stop listening. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled up, lights off, no sirens, the way you send the message without saying you're sending one. 2 officers got out. The younger one looked nervous. The older one had a buzz cut going silver at the temples and the kind of posture that only comes from 20 years of service. He looked at my uniform, and something in his face shifted. "Lieutenant Colonel Calder?" he asked. I nodded. "Ma'am, I need you to understand something," he said, and his voice was almost gentle. "This is a civil property matter. We don't have the authority to determine who owns this house. but the current occupant has asked you to leave, and if you don't, that becomes a trespassing issue. I'm sorry, that's the law. I want to tell you, I argued. I didn't. 22 years of service teaches you when a fight is winnable on the ground you're standing on and when it isn't. This wasn't. So I turned, and I walked back down the driveway, past the hydrangeas my grandmother used to grow, past the mailbox with our family name still stenciled on the side in paint that was starting to peel. I heard the gate lock behind me, and somewhere in that sound, something in my chest went very quiet and very cold. I wasn't fighting an enemy on foreign soil this time. I was fighting blood. And I had absolutely no intention of losing. I didn't have anywhere to go, not really, so I pulled up a rideshare app and rented a car from a lot near the highway because a cab wasn't going to cut it for what came next. I drove, carefully the way you drive when your hands are shaking and you don't want anyone to notice, back to a spot 2 blocks from the house, and I parked. And I sat there in the dark with my coat zipped to my chin. The house still glowed soft amber at the windows, like nothing inside had changed, but everything had. The front lawn, once dotted with my grandmother's flowers, now held a single sign, staked crooked into the grass, "For Sale, Privatlichen." I stared at that sign until the letters blurred. I hadn't cried in years. Not when I deployed the first time. Not when we lost 2 soldiers outside a checkpoint in a place I'm still not allowed to name. Not even when I came home to an empty apartment with a pension felt more like a headstone than a thank you. But that night, sitting in a rental car outside the house where I learned to read a coppice and memorize Morse code from a man who called me Colonel before I ever earned the rank, that night, something in me cracked. I thought about calling someone. There wasn't really anyone left to call. My unit was scattered across 3 continents by now, and the few numbers I still had saved were for people who'd understand exactly what I was feeling but couldn't do a single thing about it from 4,000 miles away. So I sat with it alone the way I'd sat with worse things alone before, and told myself that discipline was just another word for getting through the next 5 minutes without falling apart. And in the 5 minutes after that, I stayed until almost dawn. Around 6, a light came on inside, and I watched a figure move behind the curtains in the living room. I knew the posture before I saw the face. My father, still thin, still upright, like he'd fallen asleep standing at attention in a boardroom. He never once looked toward the street. My phone buzzed. One new message. No name attached. Your assignment was extended. There's nothing here for you. Return to base. I stared at those words for a long time. Whoever sent that message knew things they shouldn't have known, knew the language of my old life, knew enough to make it sound official. I didn't know it yet, but that text message was the first thread in a much bigger knot, and I was about to spend the next 6 weeks pulling on it until the whole thing came apart in my hands. I wasn't going back to any base. I wasn't built for surrender. I was built for exactly the opposite. At 900 hours the next morning, I walked into a small coffee shop off Jefferson Street. Sasha Whitcomb was already there, in the back corner, dressed like she hadn't slept but had still managed to look like she owned the room. We'd been roommates freshman year of college, a friendship that got interrupted by my enlistment and never quite resumed, just checked in on itself every couple of years through holiday texts. When she looked up and saw me, her face did something complicated, recognition, and then something close to worry. She didn't ask how I'd been. She turned her tablet toward me instead. "I think you need to see this," she said. On the screen was a real estate listing, 1450 Sycamore Ridge Road, my grandfather's address, filed under a holding company called Ridgeline Colt Holdings, LLC. "I didn't sign anything," I said. "I know." She swiped to another screen, a property transfer filed 3 months ago. My name sat on the seller line, next to a signature that curved the wrong way on every letter I actually knew how to write. "That's not your signature?" "No," I said quietly. "It's not." "Then we're going to prove that," Sasha said, and something in her voice had already turned into the voice of a lawyer building a case. "Because I don't think this is just a family falling apart, Joey. I think somebody planned this." "How long have you known?" I asked. "A few weeks?" "I do title work on the side. Real estate law's my bread and butter. Family law is more of a hobby I can't seem to quit. Your address came up on a routine title search I was running for an unrelated client, and something about the timeline bothered me enough to dig further. I should have called you sooner. I didn't know how to say it over the phone. You could have just said it. Would you have believed me a year ago before you'd seen any of this with your own eyes?" Sasha shook her head slowly. People don't want to hear that their family forged their signature. They want to hear it's a misunderstanding. I figured you deserved to see the paper trail before you had to decide whether to believe it. I looked down at the tablet again, at the curve of a signature that wasn't mine sitting under my name like a mask wearing my face. I believe it, I said. I just don't understand it yet. That's what we're going to fix, Sasha said. Piece by piece, document by document, until there's nothing left for them to hide behind. And just like that, the shape of the fight became clear. Not a war fought overseas. A war fought in ink, in filing cabinets, in a house that had my name erased from every document that mattered. We sat there for the better part of an hour while Sasha pulled up file after file, notarized transfers, filing records, county registry documents. She moved through them like she'd done this 100 times. I felt like I was learning a new language, one that used betrayal for punctuation. This notary, Sasha said, tapping the corner of one document, was suspended 18 months ago for falsifying signatures on DMB affidavits. Her stamp is on your deed transfer. My jaw tightened. So they didn't just steal the house, they planned it. And they made it look clean. Sasha flipped to another page. You said your grandfather told you the house was yours. He told me in person, I said. The week before he died. He never got around to sending me the paperwork. I was overseas, communications were limited. I always figured there'd be time. Sasha's expression softened, just slightly, and then hardened again as she pulled out a printed registry record. There's a will filed a month after he passed. It leaves everything to your father and your sister. My stomach dropped. They forged it. Maybe, or coerced it. Either way, it doesn't match what you're telling me he wanted. We need to find an original, or something close to it. Old emails, old recordings, anything with a timestamp. I might have something, I said slowly. He used to send me videos when I was deployed, little updates. I never deleted anything from him. I couldn't. Sasha's eyes lit up in a way that told me she was already building the case in her head. If we find even one inconsistency, handwriting, timestamps, a witness who doesn't check out, that's enough to open a civil claim. Maybe more than civil, depending on what else is buried in this. They told me to my face I didn't matter, I said, that the house was never mine, and now I find out they buried it under a shell company. Here's what really bothers me, Sasha said, pulling up one more document. Your grandfather's original will, the one filed years before his death, lists your mother as a witness. This new one, the one that surfaces conveniently a month after he's gone, has 2 witnesses neither of us has ever heard of, addresses that trace back to a P.O. box. Signatures that, frankly, look like the same hand wrote both of them, just disguised a little differently each time. Denise Okonkwo, I said, reading the notary stamp at the bottom. That's her. Suspended notary license, works out of a strip mall office that does document services for cash. She's notarized at least 4 other property transfers in the county over the past 2 years that are currently under separate review by the state bar. You're not the first person this happened to. You might just be the first one with the resources to actually fight it. Ridgeline Cold Holdings is the buffer, Sasha said. But I pulled the filing history. Marcus Voss's name shows up on the associated logistics paperwork. My hands went still on the table. Dana's husband. Runs an international freight and cold storage company. Always traveling, never very specific about where. Sasha clicked her pen. I'm going to petition the court to freeze the title while we investigate. That part's clean. That part I can do today. They think I won't fight back, I said. They don't know you, Sasha said. But they're about to. That night, I drove past the house one more time. The porch light was off. My grandmother's hydrangeas were gone. The beds mulched over like someone had tried to erase every trace that a family with a history had ever lived there. They'd taken my home on paper. But I still had a pen of my own, and I intended to use it to write myself back in the right way this time, the legal way, the way that would hold up. The next morning, Sasha called before I'd finished my coffee. Her voice was calm, the way it gets right before she tells you something that isn't. I need to tell you about your mother, she said. What about her? There's a guardianship filing. Your father petitioned the court almost a year ago, claims your mother has cognitive decline, that she needs a conservator to manage her affairs. The court granted it. He controls her finances, her medical decisions, where she lives, who she's allowed to see. I sat down slowly on the edge of the rental car's hood because my legs didn't feel steady enough to hold me standing. Dana told me Mom didn't want to see me. Or your father decided for her, Sasha said, and told Dana what to say. Something in me went cold in a different way than it had at the front door. In my line of work, we call it information control. Cut off a target's access to outside voices, and you control the narrative completely. I'd spent 22 years learning to spot exactly that pattern in enemy operations. I had never once imagined I'd find it running through my own family, with my mother at the center of it. I want to see her, I said. I'm working on it, Sasha said. There's a process. We petition for a welfare visit, maybe a review of the conservatorship itself if we can show cause. It'll take a little time. I know that's not what you want to hear. I've waited 22 years to come home, I said. I can wait a little longer to do this right. 3 days later, Sasha called again, and this time there was something new underneath the calm in her voice, something closer to urgency. I pulled utility records for the address listed under Ridgeline Cold Holdings, she said. It's a warehouse, not a residence, industrial cold storage, but the power draw is enormous. Sustained load, 24 hours a day, for months. What's the permit say it's for? That's the thing, there isn't one. No refrigerated storage permit, no business license matching that kind of use. Whatever's in there, it isn't on paper. I felt the old instinct rise in my chest, the one that used to keep me alive on deployments, the itch to go look for myself. But I promised Sasha and myself that I wasn't going to be the reason this case fell apart on a technicality. I know someone who might be able to help, I said. Federal side. That someone was Special Agent Tom Reyes, out of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, the branch that investigates fraud against the Department of Defense and the VA. I'd worked adjacent to his office years earlier on a joint task force, back when my specialty still occasionally crossed into procurement fraud. I hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. He answered on the second ring. Colonel Calder, he said, like no time had passed at all. To what do I owe this? I think someone's using my identity to defraud the federal government, I said, and I think it's connected to my family. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that meant he was already taking notes. Tell me everything. 2 days after that call, Reyes met me and Sasha in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. He slid a folder across the table. You know what SD-VOSB stands for? He asked. Service Disabled, Veteran-Owned Small Business, I said. Federal contracting set aside. Preferential bidding for companies owned and controlled by disabled veterans. Right. Well, there's a logistics company registered under that designation. Cold Chain Transport. Government contracts worth a little over $4 million over the last 2 years. Company's called Ridgeline Cold Transport. Owner of record. He turned the folder around so I could see it myself. Josephine M. Calder. I stared at my own name sitting in a box on a federal registration form I had never filled out, never signed, never even heard of until that moment. That's not possible. I know, Reyes said. The application used a copy of your DD-214 and your social security number. Somebody built an entire company on your identity, Colonel. Your veteran status is the whole reason this business qualified for those contracts in the first place. Without you on paper, none of this exists. I sat back in my chair, and for a second I couldn't say anything at all. 22 years of my life, the deployments, the classified hearings, the friends I'd buried, reduced to a signature line on a fraud scheme. They hadn't just taken my house. They'd taken the one thing I actually earned with my own hands and turned it into a tool to steal from the government I'd served. How does something like this even get approved? I asked, once I trusted my voice again. Aren't there verification steps? There are, Reyes said, and most of the time they work. But the program relies heavily on self-certification at the application stage, with audits happening after contracts are already awarded, sometimes years later. Whoever set this up understood that gap. They used your discharge paperwork to establish veteran status, listed you as majority owner on paper, and then had VOS run day-to-day operations under a management agreement, which technically violates the ownership and control requirements of the program. But it's the kind of violation that only gets caught if someone goes looking. Most of the time, nobody's looking. This time, somebody was. $4 million, Sasha said quietly, reading over my shoulder. In contracts your name is attached to, and you never saw a cent of it. That's not entirely true, Reyes said, and something in his tone made me brace for whatever came next. There's a bank account under your name, opened using your identity, same as the company, that's received deposits over the past 2 years. Small amounts, staggered, designed to look unremarkable. Whoever set this up wanted a paper trail that made it look like you were a knowing, willing participant, in case anyone ever asked questions. Oh, they were building a case against me, I said slowly, in case I ever found out. That's exactly what I think they were doing, Reyes said, which is one more reason we do this by the book, from here on out. Because if this goes to trial, and I believe it will, the first thing a defense attorney is going to try is painting you as a co-conspirator instead of a victim. We're not going to give them that opening. Who's listed as the operating manager? Sasha asked. Reyes flipped a page. Marcus, boss. Of course. This is bigger than a family dispute now, Reyes said. This is federal fraud, False Claims Act, identity theft, and, depending on what's in that warehouse, possibly a lot worse. I can open a formal investigation, but I need you to understand something, Colonel. From this point forward, everything has to go through proper channels. No independent surveillance, no confrontations. If this ends up in court, and I think it will, we cannot have a defense attorney arguing that evidence was gathered illegally by the alleged victim herself. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand, I said, and I meant it. I'd spent my whole career learning that the fastest way to lose a case wasn't a lack of evidence. It was evidence collected the wrong way. Then let's do this the right way, Reyes said, starting with that warehouse. DCIS obtained a warrant within the week. Reyes's office had moved fast once the SDVOSB fraud was confirmed because defrauding a federal set-aside program built specifically to help disabled veterans was, in his words, the kind of thing that makes judges sign paperwork quickly. While the warrant was in process, Devin Okafor came into the picture. Devin and I had served together on a joint cyber task force out of Ramstein years back, the kind of colleague you don't talk to for 2 years and then pick right back up with like no time passed. He was working cybersecurity and financial forensics for a private contractor that consulted with DCIS on cases exactly like this one. Your friend Sasha sent me everything, Devin said over a video call. His face lit blue from 3 monitors. Wire transfers, shell company filings, notary records. Give me a night. He didn't need a night. He called back in 4 hours. Okay, he said. Ridgeline Cold Holdings owns the property. Ridgeline Cold Transport. The fraudulent SDVOSB company leases it. Money moves from the federal contracts into cold transport, then gets split 3 ways. A chunk to a shell account tied to Marcus Voss, a chunk to an account under Dana Calder Voss, and a chunk, this is the part you need to see, to an account that traces back to your father. Walter, I said, more to myself than to him. There's a leasing contract for the warehouse, Devin said, signed by a county land use supervisor, authorizing industrial cold storage use on a property zoned residential adjacent. Signature belongs to a Walter Calder. I closed my eyes. My father had spent 30 years working land use approvals for the county. It was the kind of quiet, respectable government job nobody thinks twice about until you realize it's the exact job that lets you legally authorize your own crime. He didn't just know, I said. He built the door they walked through. There's one more thing, Devin said, and he hesitated in a way that wasn't like him. He'd always been the one to deliver bad news flat and fast. No cushioning, because he said cushioning just made it hurt twice. This time he paused. The anonymous text you got the night you were locked out of the house, I traced the number. It bounced through 3 burner relays, but the last one ties back to a prepaid phone purchased with a card linked to your father's business account. He sent it himself, I said. Looks that way. And Joey? The message referenced your deployment status. Whoever sent it knew or thought they knew that your assignment had been extended. That's not public information. That's the kind of thing that requires either inside knowledge of military personnel systems or someone close enough to you that they'd know your original timeline and just gambled that you wouldn't check. My CO, I said slowly, working through it the way I would any operational puzzle. My father used to golf with a colonel who worked in personnel readiness years ago before he retired. If Dad still had that contact. We'll look into it, Devin said, but even without confirming exactly how he knew, the point stands. He wasn't hoping you wouldn't come home. He was actively trying to keep you away, right up until the moment you were already standing on that porch. I thought about the message again. Return to base. There's nothing here for you, and understood, for the first time, that it hadn't been a lie meant to comfort me. It had been an order, dressed up to look like one, from a man who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how to make illegitimate things look official. The night before the warehouse warrant was set to execute, I couldn't sleep. So I did the only thing that had ever calmed me down in 22 years of not being able to sleep before something important. I went through old files. My grandfather used to send me video messages when I was deployed, little 5-minute updates about the garden, the weather, the neighbor's dog. I'd saved every one of them onto a backup drive I never quite got around to organizing. I found it at 2 in the morning, a video from 6 years earlier, my grandfather sitting in his old recliner, half a cup of coffee going cold beside him. Joey, if you're watching this, it means I finally figured out how to work this camera. His laugh crackled through the old recording and my throat tightened just hearing it. I want you to know something, in case I never get around to putting it on paper the right way. This house, it's yours. Not your sister's, not your father's. Yours. You're the one who sat with me out on that porch and asked me 100 questions about the war I never wanted to talk about with anybody else. You earned this house a long time before I'm gone. I love you, kid. Come home safe. I sat on the floor of a rental apartment I didn't even own yet, and I let myself cry for the first time since I'd landed in this country. Not from grief, from relief, because now I had something no forged document could argue with. A living, time-stamped, unmistakably real recording of a man's actual voice, telling the truth. I kept watching it, over and over, that same 5 minutes, until I noticed something I'd missed the first 3 times through. Behind my grandfather, propped on the side table next to his coffee cup, was an envelope with my mother's handwriting on it. I paused the video and zoomed in as far as the old resolution would allow. It read, "Witnessed and true. E.C. Eleanor Calder." My mother had witnessed this recording being made. She'd known all along exactly what her father-in-law intended, years before he passed, years before any of this began, which meant that somewhere along the way, she'd either been silenced before she could say so, or she'd tried to say so and no one had listened. I sent the video to Sasha before the sun came up. She called me 40 minutes later. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, "combined with the will discrepancy, the notary suspension, and everything Reyes has on the fraud. Joey, this is a case now, a real one." The warehouse raid happened at 0600 hours on a Thursday. I wasn't there. Reyes had made that very clear and I respected it, even though every instinct in me wanted to be standing in that parking lot. Instead, I sat in Sasha's office, phone on the table between us, waiting. At 6:01 tween, Reyes called. "We're in," he said. Marcus Voss was on site, receiving a shipment. "We've got pallets of pharmaceutical cold chain product, insulin, several controlled medications, vaccine stock. Preliminary tracing shows a portion of it diverted from VA regional supply chains and military treatment facility shipments. Somebody's been skimming product meant for veterans and active duty patients and reselling it on a secondary market." I sat very still, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something shift inside my chest that was bigger than my own anger. This had stopped being about a stolen house a long time ago, and I think some part of me had known it, but hearing it said out loud made it real in a different way. They weren't just stealing from me, they were stealing medicine from people who'd worn the same uniform I had, people who needed it to stay alive. "Marcus is in custody," Reyes said. "We're bringing in Walter Calder for questioning this afternoon. And Dana? We're building toward her too. But Colonel, I want you to hear something first, before you go anywhere near that house." He played me an audio clip pulled from a lawfully authorized wiretap on Marcus's phone, obtained through the warrant. 2 voices. One I recognized instantly, even distorted through a cheap phone speaker. "If the officer finds out, we sever the tie," my father's voice said. Slow, gravel line, utterly calm. "She's not supposed to be anywhere near this." I didn't say anything for a long moment. 22 years of training taught me how to process information without letting my face show what it cost me. It didn't teach me how to survive hearing my own father plan around the possibility of my discovery like I was a liability to be managed, not a daughter to be loved. I documented everything I could, the right way. I finally said, "Now it's your turn to finish it." 2 days later, with the guardianship review finally granted after Sasha's emergency petition, I was allowed a supervised visit with my mother. Eleanor Calder was sitting in a small side room at a care facility my father had placed her in 8 months earlier, not because she needed it, I would later learn, but because it was easier to control who she saw. When she looked up and saw me standing in the doorway in my uniform, her hands started to shake. "Josephine?" Her voice cracked on my name like she wasn't sure it was allowed to come out of her mouth. "It's me, Mom." I crossed the room faster than I meant to and knelt in front of her chair, and she reached for my face like she needed to confirm I was real. "They told me you didn't want to see me," she whispered. "They took my phone. They said I was confused, that I said things that weren't true, that I needed someone to make decisions for me." Her hands tightened around mine. "I never said I didn't want to see you. I never said that." Sob. Sob sounds implied, but no tag available. "I've been asking about you every single day." I felt something crack wide open in my chest, something I'd been holding together with sheer discipline since the moment Dana told me my mother didn't want me in her life. It had been a lie. All of it. My mother hadn't rejected me. She'd been silenced, cut off, medicated into a version of herself that couldn't fight back, and my father had used that silence as a weapon. The same way he'd used land use authority and forged signatures and a company built on my stolen name. "I'm going to fix this," I said. "All of it." "Your father," Eleanor said, and her voice dropped low, careful, like even now the habit of caution hadn't worn off. "He's not who you think he is, Joey. He hasn't been for a long time. I saw the real will, your grandfather's real will. I saw it before your father made it disappear." "Where?" "I don't know where it is now," she said. "But I know it existed, because I was a witness when he signed it. Ask the county recorder's office. There should be a filing record, even if the document itself is gone. I found a video, Mom, Grandpa, from about 6 years ago. He talks about the house. And there's an envelope in the shot with your handwriting on it. Witnessed and true." Eleanor's eyes filled, and for a moment she couldn't speak at all. "He asked me to write that down after we recorded it," she finally said. "He said, 'Someday somebody's going to try to say this isn't real. I want proof it happened, and proof that somebody besides me heard it.' He was always 3 steps ahead of everyone, your grandfather. I think, somewhere, he knew exactly what your father was capable of, even back then. He just didn't have the proof yet. None of us did." "You tried to tell someone, didn't you?" I said. "It wasn't really a question. That's why he did this to you. The guardianship, the isolation." Her hands tightened around mine, and something like shame passed over her face, though none of this had ever been her fault. "I went to a lawyer about a year after your grandfather passed. Told her I thought Walter was hiding the real will. She wanted more information than I had. Before I could get it, your father had already started talking about my memory, my confusion, whether I was safe to live alone. I didn't understand what was happening to me until it had already happened. By the time I realized he was building a case against my own competency, I didn't have anyone left to tell. He'd made sure of that too." I squeezed her hand. "I love you, Mom. I love you too," she said. "I never stopped, not for a single day, no matter what they told you I said." Before any of that, though, there was one more conversation I needed to have with Dana. Sasha advised against it strongly, and Reyes advised against it even more strongly, given the ongoing investigation. But I'd spent 22 years learning that sometimes you have to look the person across from you in the eyes once before you let the system take over and finish the job properly. So I called her. To my surprise, she answered. "We met at a diner on the edge of town, neutral ground, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a jukebox nobody had used in years." Dana looked thinner than I remembered. Tired in a way that makeup couldn't quite cover. "You shouldn't be here," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Marcus says I shouldn't talk to you at all." "I'm not here to talk about the case," I said, which was mostly true. "I'm here because you're my sister, and in a few weeks none of us are going to have the option of pretending that's simple anymore." She wrapped both hands around a coffee mug she hadn't touched. "You think I wanted any of this?" "I think you knew something was wrong, and you decided it was easier not to ask the questions that would have confirmed it," I said. "I've read some of what Marcus's business filings look like, Dana. Nobody's finances look like that by accident. At some point you had to have known." "I knew Dad was helping Marcus with some kind of leasing arrangement," she said, her voice dropping. "I knew it wasn't exactly clean. I told myself it was tax stuff, moving money around, the kind of thing rich people do that isn't technically illegal, even if it feels a little slippery. I didn't know about the warehouse. I didn't know about." She stopped herself, and something crossed her face that looked almost like fear. "I didn't know what was actually in it. I swear to you, Joey, I didn't know." "And the will?" I asked. "The deed? My signature on a document I never touched?" Her hands tightened on the mug. "Dad told me you'd signed off on everything before you left for your last deployment. He said you two had an arrangement, that you didn't want the responsibility of the house, that you'd rather have a cash settlement down the line instead. I wanted to believe him. It was easier than wondering why my own father would lie to me about something like that. Do you believe him now? She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were wet, and for the first time since I'd come home, I saw something in her face that looked less like the woman who'd threatened to call the police on her own sister, and more like the girl I used to share a bedroom with, who used to be afraid of thunderstorms and would crawl into my bed at 2 in the morning without ever admitting why. No, she said quietly. I don't think I ever really did. I think I just didn't want to be the one who found out for sure. You still have a chance to be honest now, I said. That's the only thing I came here to say. Whatever happens to Dad, whatever happens to Marcus, what happens to you is still, at least partly, up to you. I left that diner without any promises from her, and without forgiveness fully extended either. Some things take longer than a single conversation to rebuild, if they can be rebuilt at all. But 2 weeks later, her attorney reached out to Reyes's office, and Dana began cooperating fully with the investigation, providing financial records and internal communications that helped close several remaining gaps in the case against Marcus and my father. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was a start, and in my experience, most real change begins exactly there, with someone choosing finally to stop looking away. Sasha found the filing record within a day, a will filed for notarization 5 years before my grandfather's death, witnessed by Eleanor Calder, and a second witness who, it turned out, had also witnessed the county land use paperwork my father had signed to authorize the warehouse lease. The connections were tightening into something undeniable. Reyes called that evening. We've got enough, he said. Identity theft, wire fraud, False Claims Act violations tied to the federal contracts, controlled substance diversion, and now a documented pattern of guardianship abuse that a family court judge is going to have a field day with. We're moving forward with federal charges against Walter Calder and Marcus Voss. Dana Calder Voss is cooperating. Her attorney reached out this morning. She says she didn't know the full scope of what her husband and father were doing. Says she thought it was tax avoidance, nothing more. Do you believe her? I asked. I believe people convince themselves of a lot of things when the money's good, and asking questions feels dangerous, Reyes said. That'll be for a jury to weigh, not me. The court date arrived on a gray morning in late November. I wore my uniform, ribbon squared away, silver oak leaf on my shoulder, catching the fluorescent light of the federal courthouse hallway. I hadn't worn it since my discharge ceremony, and putting it on again for this felt like closing a circle I hadn't known needed closing. You ready? Sasha asked, straightening the folder in her hands. I've been ready since the day they called me a stranger at my own front door, I said. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. No shouting, no dramatic outbursts, just the steady, procedural pulse of federal justice doing exactly what it was built to do. I sat behind the witness table when it was my turn, spine straight, hands folded, and told the truth in the same flat, clear voice I used to use briefing generals. They forged my signature on a deed transferring my grandfather's house, I said. They filed a false will. They used my military discharge paperwork and my social security number to register a fraudulent federal contracting company in my name, and they used the proceeds from that fraud, along with diverted pharmaceutical shipments meant for veterans and service members, to enrich themselves. My mother was placed under an unnecessary guardianship, so she couldn't interfere or reach out to me. I didn't come home from 22 years of service to be erased from my own family's history. I came home to write myself back into it. Dana sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. Marcus kept whispering to his attorney. My father stared past me, at some point on the far wall, as if refusing to look directly at me might make the evidence disappear. It didn't. Devin testified after me, walking the courtroom through the financial architecture of the fraud on a projector screen. The shell company, the layer transfers, the small staggered deposits into the account opened in my name. He spoke the way he always had in briefings, precise and unhurried, letting the numbers do the emotional work instead of his voice. When the prosecutor asked him to summarize the total financial harm, he didn't hesitate. Between the fraudulent federal contracts, the diverted pharmaceutical product, and the attempted seizure of a residential property valued at approximately $600,000, the total scope of the scheme exceeds $5 million, he said. That figure doesn't include the cost of the guardianship proceedings against Eleanor Calder, which the state is pursuing separately. Reyes testified next, describing the warehouse raid in the same flat procedural tone he'd used on the phone with me that morning: pallets of diverted insulin and vaccine stock, falsified shipping manifests designed to make stolen product look like standard commercial inventory, a paper trail that led back through 3 layers of shell companies before it ever touched my name. When he described the moment agents found boxes stamped with Department of Veterans Affairs regional distribution codes sitting inside a warehouse that had no legal authorization to hold pharmaceutical product at all, I watched 2 jurors glance at each other, and I understood that whatever sympathy the defense might have hoped to generate for a family dispute had just evaporated entirely. Eleanor testified too, and I hadn't expected how hard it would be to watch. She sat straighter than I'd seen her sit in over a year, hands steady in her lap, and told the court about the guardianship petition, about losing her phone, about being told for months that her only daughter didn't want to see her. When the defense attorney tried gently to suggest her memory of events might not be entirely reliable, she looked directly at him and said, "I've had a full neuropsychological evaluation ordered by this court in the last 30 days. Sir, I'd be happy to have you read it into the record if you'd like the jury to hear exactly how reliable my memory is." The attorney did not take her up on the offer. The prosecutor entered the original will into evidence, the one Eleanor had witnessed, the one the county recorder confirmed had been filed and later deliberately suppressed. Devon's financial trail went up on a screen: the wire transfers, the shell accounts, the fraudulent SDVOSB registration. My grandfather's video message played for the courtroom, his voice, warm, sure, unmistakably his, filling a room built for cold procedure with something that sounded almost like grace. And then the wiretap recording played. My father's voice, slow and certain. "If the officer finds out, we sever the tie." The prosecutor turned to me. "In your professional opinion, Colonel Calder, was this a deliberate, coordinated conspiracy?" "Yes," I said. "They didn't just try to erase my name. They used it. They built an operation on my silence and on my mother's silence, and they very nearly got away with it." The verdicts came 3 weeks later. Walter Calder, 18 years federal no parole eligibility for the first 12 on charges of wire fraud, identity theft violations of the False Claims Act, and conspiracy related to the diversion of controlled pharmaceuticals from veteran and military supply chains. The guardianship abuse charges were referred separately to state court, where a judge later terminated his conservatorship over my mother permanently and barred him from any future guardianship petitions. Marcus Voss, 11 years federal on charges related to operating the fraudulent SDVOSB company in the pharmaceutical diversion scheme. Dana Calder Voss, 3 years with significant credit for cooperation on reduced charges related to financial fraud, plus 5 years of supervised probation and 400 hours of community service, much of it later assigned to veteran support organizations, which I later heard she actually completed without complaint. There was no dramatic gavel bang, no shouted objections, no one storming the room. Just a judge reading numbers into a record and the quiet, heavy sound of 3 futures collapsing under the weight of what they'd built. When the judge read my father's sentence, he didn't flinch. He'd spent 30 years perfecting the art of looking unbothered in rooms where other people's futures were being decided, and I suppose old habits hold on longest in the moments that matter most. But I was watching his hands folded on the table in front of him, and I saw them tighten, just slightly, at the number 18. It was the only honest reaction I ever saw out of him in that entire proceeding. Marcus put his head down when his sentence was read. Dana cried. Quietly, without theater, the kind of crying that comes from a person who has finally run out of ways to avoid what she's done. When the judge addressed her directly, acknowledging her cooperation and her reduced culpability compared to her husband and father, she looked over at me for the first time in the entire trial. "I'm sorry," she mouthed. I don't know if she meant it. I don't know if it matters whether she did. I nodded once, not forgiveness exactly, just acknowledgement that I'd hurt her, and let it go at that. Some things you carry forward. Some things you set down in a courtroom and walk away from because carrying them any further would cost you more than they're worth. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, but I didn't stop for them. I saw the veterans instead. A small cluster gathered near the steps, some in faded service jackets, one leaning on a cane, all of them watching me pass with something steady in their faces. One of them, an older man with a Vietnam-era pin on his collar, reached out and shook my hand. "Colonel," he said, "you reminded a lot of us that somebody still fights for us, even after we take the uniform off." "We don't stay erased," I told him. "Not if we can help it." 6 months later, I stood in the driveway of the house on Sycamore Ridge Road, holding a key that finally, legally, unmistakably, belonged to me. My mother stood beside me, healthier than I'd seen her in years, off the excess medication, back in touch with old friends my father had quietly cut out of her life one by one, laughing again in a way I hadn't heard since I was a teenager sneaking back in past curfew. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," she said, looking up at the house. "He already told me he was," I said. 6 years ago, I just didn't know I'd need to hear it again this badly. We walked up the porch steps together, past a fresh bed of hydrangeas I planted myself, the same variety my grandmother used to grow. The FOR sale sign was long gone. The porch light was on, and for the first time in over a year, it actually meant what it looked like it meant. Sasha came by that weekend with a bottle of wine neither of us really needed an excuse to open, and we sat out on the porch until the streetlights came on. The way I used to with my grandfather when I was a kid, trying to memorize Morse code faster than he could tap it out. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Sasha said, swirling her glass. "The night you told me you didn't sign anything. You said it so calmly, like you already knew exactly how you were going to prove it." "I didn't know," I said. "I just knew I wasn't going to let it stand unanswered. There's a difference. In my line of work, you learn pretty fast that certainty is a luxury. Most of the time, you're working with fragments, trying to build something true out of pieces that don't want to fit together. This wasn't so different in the end, just a lot more personal." "Devin says he's putting together a non-profit," Sasha said, "something to help other veterans check for exactly this kind of fraud. Stolen SD-VOSB registrations, identity misuse in federal contracting. Says your case opened his eyes to how common it probably is, how few people ever find out." "Tell him I want in," I said. "Whatever he needs." Reyes called a few weeks after the sentencing, not about the case. That part was closed-filed. Done. But to tell me that DCIS had used the pattern uncovered in my father's scheme to flag 2 similar SD-VOSB fraud cases in neighboring states, both involving veterans who had no idea their identities were being used at all. "You didn't just get your own name back, Colonel," he said. "You handed us a blueprint for finding the next people this happens to before it cost them as much as it cost you." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. 22 years of service had taught me to measure success in operations completed, threats neutralized, missions closed out clean. This wasn't a mission. It had never had rules of engagement, never had a clear chain of command, never had the comfort of knowing exactly who the enemy was until the enemy turned out to be wearing my father's face. But it had an outcome I could live with, and more than that, it had an outcome that reached past my own front door and did some good for people I'd never meet. Weeks after that, I found myself standing in the quiet of a Defense Service library, the kind of building that smells like polished stone and old memory. On the wall of honor, carved into black granite, was my name. Lieutenant Colonel Josephine Calder, Military Intelligence, 2002-2020-24. No one could take that from me. Not my father, not the forged signatures, not the year I spent locked out of my own history. I stood there for a long time, tracing the letters with 2 fingers, and I thought about everything that had happened since the night a police officer told me, gently, that the law couldn't help me yet. The law had helped me eventually. It had just needed the truth handed to it the right way, patiently, legally, one document, one witness, one honest voice at a time. I didn't walk away from that courtroom with the house. Not really, not at first. The deed took another 2 months to fully clear. I didn't walk away with any of my father's money because I never wanted it. What I walked away with was my name, restored and unimpeachable. My mother's freedom. My grandfather's true wishes, finally honored instead of buried. And the particular hard-won kind of peace that doesn't come with noise. It comes with clarity. Some evenings I still drive out to that library just to sit on the bench across from the Wall of Honor with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands. The same way my grandfather always let his coffee go cold while he was thinking through something important. I think about all the people out there right now living some version of what I lived, locked out of a house, a name, a story that belongs to them by someone who assumed silence would hold. I think about my mother and how close the world came to losing her voice entirely inside a system built, in theory, to protect people like her. I think about the veterans I never met whose medicine sat frozen in a warehouse that had no right to hold it. And how easily that theft could have stayed hidden if nobody had ever asked the right question at the right time. I used to think the most important skill I ever learned in uniform was how to find the enemy hiding inside the noise. I know better now. The most important skill I learned was how to keep speaking, clearly and patiently, even when the people who were supposed to love me most were counting on my silence. They took my home on paper. But paper lies, and truth, once it's written down correctly, witnessed, dated, unafraid, cannot be erased twice. And in that clarity, for the first time since I stepped off that plane onto a sidewalk that no longer felt like mine, I stood completely, quietly, unshaken.